Hello, can you all hear me? Yes? Hey! Nice to see you all. How about a round of applause for all of us still existing? Yeah. So my name is Victor LaValle. I have the great honor of being in conversation today with Kristen Arnett and Brando Skyhorse. And the way we're going to basically do this is called readings in conversation. So what we plan to do is I'm our nominal moderator, by which that just means I'm saying this part. And I'll ask some questions later that will kind of get us going. But we're each going to read just a short little bit from one of our books. And then that bit that we read is going to lead us into conversation together now that we hope will be engaging and interesting, yeah? So I'm just going to start a very little bit from the very beginning of my novel, Lone Women. And here we go. There are two kinds of people in this world, those who live with shame and those who die from it. On Tuesday, Adelaide Henry would have called herself the former, but by Wednesday, she wasn't as sure. If she was trying to live, then why would she be walking through her family's farmhouse, carrying an Atlas jar of gasoline, pouring that gasoline on the kitchen floor, the dining table, dousing the settee in the den? And after she emptied the first Atlas jar, why go back to the kitchen for the other jar, then climb the stairs to the second floor, listening to the splash of gasoline on every step? Was she planning to live or trying to die? There were 27 black farming families in California's Lucerne Valley in 1915. Adelaide and her parents had been one of them. After today, there would be only 26. Adelaide reached the second floor landing. She hardly smelled the gasoline anymore. Her hands were covered in fresh wounds, but she felt no pain. There were two bedrooms on the second floor, her bedroom and her parents'. Adelaide's parents were lured west by the promise of land in this valley. The federal government encouraged Americans to homestead California. The native population had been decimated, cleared off the property. Now it was time to give it all away. This invitation was one of the few that the United States extended to even its Negro citizens. And after 1866, the African Society put out a call to colonize Southern California. The Henrys were among the hundreds who came. They weren't going to get a fair shot in Arkansas, that was for damn sure. The federal government called this homesteading. Glenville and Eleanor Henry fled to California and grew alfalfa and wild grass, sold it to cattle owners for feed. Glenville studied the work of Luther Burbank, and in 1968, they began growing the botanist's Santa Rosa plums. To Adelaide, the fruit tasted of sugar and self-determination. Adelaide had worked the orchards and fields alongside her daddy since she was 12, labored in the kitchen and the barn with her mother for even longer. 31 years of life on this farm, 31. And now she would burn it all down. Thank you.
How you doing? Good, you answered. I only have 5 minutes to try and convince you to buy my book, so hopefully this will go quickly. Quick shout out to Victor, Kristen, Arlo Haskell, and of course La Madrina, the godmother, Meg Cabot herself. She's here, right? I see you. So, real quick, just some setup here. In August 2023, I published a novel that I've been writing for 7 years called My Name is Iris, and in the book, my central character is an American-born Latina named Iris Prince. And she votes for a new state law allowing a Silicon Valley company to launch a high-tech ID wristband that restricts all state services, like schools and driver's licenses and things like that, only to people who can prove parental citizenship. And she votes for this law thinking that it will keep her safe and protect her way of life, that it won't impact her or her 9-year-old daughter, Mel. And of course, my central character is wrong, as she learns that neither of her parents are citizens. And one morning, she wakes up and discovers there's a wall growing outside her home. And the rest of the novel follows her as she tries to protect her daughter and her family and herself amid a climate of xenophobia and rising violence. Now, I had a sense when I started promoting this book over a year and a half ago that maybe some people, not everybody, not good people like you, but maybe some people perhaps weren't ready to listen to the story that I wanted to tell them. My narrator, Iris, was too judgmental. She was too driven by anger and fear, and her every action to be likable or to be believable. I was asked by my publisher if I could try pitching this book in 5 seconds, which is something that publishers like authors to do. And so I told them my 5-second pitch was, please don't let Elon Musk read this book. And as you can imagine, everyone would find that somewhat humorous because, you know, him reading a book, but also the idea that this was something that was so far-fetched, so incredible, so unbelievable, because what I was describing was something that was not even sci-fi possible. A person of color voting to support a right-wing authoritarian position that then changes someone's day-to-day existence in extreme, life-altering ways. Never happened. Well, yeah, and then 2 months later, my dystopian novel came true. And in the wake of the election of a couple of months ago, the phrases that I have heard in countless opinion polls to explain the result was, I feel under threat, I feel undermined, and I feel afraid. But my novel, to me, wasn't this like satirical take on where we are in as a country, but an exploration of family bonds. What happens within our own family when each of us is put under these various strains of identity and xenophobia and surveillance? How do we respond when our own family members engage differently than we would to fear? And is that fear imagined or real? My main character has a few core reasons she's afraid, but her first family lesson was what her mother taught her, which was, in this country, fear means respect. This is a short taste of the opening. Whenever I ask my mama what her first memory of America was, she says, "Who cares about me? You were born here. You were born here." That's my first strip of memories, my parents taking turns to berate me whenever I misbehaved, or later asked about their past to deflect an imminent punishment. Never stop doing that, or be quiet, or finish your dinner. It was, you were born here. It is something you can never lose. Don't forget that. My mama Dolores and my papa Gonzalo were born in Mexico. They didn't share or explain what life there was like for them. When I asked them, they said, everything is here in America. Who cares what came before? Did you forget already that you were born here? Act like it. Growing up, my mama Dolores asked me over and over, what are the rules to live in America? I didn't understand why, but I knew the answers well. Speak English in front of strangers. No Spanish anywhere outside the house. Walk far, but not too far from gringos on a sidewalk until they have acknowledged you. Call any gringo you meet sir, even if they are young. Call any gringo you meet ma'am, especially if they are old. And never, ever cry in front of anyone, even if you think they are your friend. Do that, my mama said, and they'll let you become anything you want here. Thanks, guys.
Okay, tough acts to follow. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Brando. Thank you to the seminar. Thank you to the booksellers. We can give a little shout out to the booksellers out there. They're working so hard. I'm so appreciative for them. I'm a third generation Central Floridian, and Florida stuff feels so important to me. So it's always feels like such a blessing to have things like this where we can come together and talk about art and feel things and be excited about stuff together. I'm going to read something real short from my second novel, With Teeth, and you don't really need to know anything other than this is mean gay mommy book. And I feel like the theme for me, the through line of this book was like everybody in a household's an unreliable narrator. Like we all shared the same stories, but we all told them in wildly different ways. So I'm just gonna read a little small part of that, and then we can get into yapping, which is fun. Swim practice happened every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon directly after school. That gave Sammy just enough time to pick up her son, stuff a snack into him, and then get over to the YMCA pool across town before practice began. Samson sat in the back seat eating his crackers and cheese while Sammy navigated traffic. According to his coach, Samson was a natural swimmer with a lot of power and great form for someone his age. Sammy had no clue if that was true. She didn't know much of anything about swimming, but she did know it was the first activity her son had ever actually seemed to enjoy. And she'd pushed him for other things too. He was smart. When he worked hard enough, he could do anything he wanted, and she told him that repeatedly, especially on the rare occasion when he seemed even a tiny bit interested in something. So Sammy was willing to brave the chlorine-scented room, watching him swim for hours on end. The noise was deafening sometimes, all the splashing, the shrill sound of the whistle, all of it echoing off the tile walls, the kids' shouts magnified to shrieks. But none of that mattered. Samson was flourishing there. That was reason enough. Hungry? Sammy asked. Through the rearview mirror, she saw him stacking up his snacks, cheese in one pile, crackers in the other, then eating them methodically, one cheese, one cracker, one sip of juice. One cheese, one cracker, one sip of juice. He didn't answer, but that was fine. Sammy could see he was okay with the cheese today. Sometimes it was trial and error. He did not like cheese that was orange. He did not like cheese that had holes in it. He did not like crackers with seeds or flavorings on them. He did not like orange juice. That was a weird one, not liking orange juice. All kids liked orange juice, didn't they? They lived in Florida, for God's sake. They pulled into the Y parking lot with 15 minutes to spare. It rained earlier that afternoon, and the sun was sparking diamond bright and the puddles still dotting the pavement. A blue jay sat washing itself in one, flicking water off its wings every few seconds. Sammy rolled down her window to smell the fresh air and watched a procession of moms pull their kids from their cars, carting them into the building. One mom Sammy had gotten friendly with, as friendly as she was used to being with other moms anyway, was Lenore, who had a little girl Samson's age. The two kids didn't really hit it off, but Samson didn't really hit it off with anybody. Sammy knew that feeling. It was hard for her to make friends too. She missed the queer people she'd hung around with when she was single, back before she turned into a gay mom. She always thought about it that way in capital letters because that's what happened. You turn from a queer woman into a gay mom, and suddenly your old life and friends didn't fit the vibe of your new life. There were no gay mommy groups in Orlando, hardly any gay people in her everyday interactions besides her wife. Sammy liked the way Lenore talked. She was blunt and aggressive, and she didn't put up with the other moms' attempts at fake chit-chat. The first time they talked had been an accident. Lenore was sitting at the top of the bleachers, waving in Sammy's direction with a big cardboard fan, and Sammy had automatically waved back. "Not you," Lenore yelled. "My kid, she's got her fucking suit on inside out again." Normally, Sammy would have been embarrassed, waving at a woman she didn't even know, like a total idiot, but instead she was impressed at the woman, swearing openly in front of a room full of 4th and 5th graders, and more impressively, their stuck-up moms. "Come up," Lenore told her. "Not my kid, you, I mean, the new kid's mom." Sammy climbed up to sit with Lenore, who handed her what looked like a water bottle full of Coke to share, or so she thought until she took a sip and found out it was really just a bottle of rum with a splash of soda for color. It felt illicit and kind of sexy to drink with all those kids around him and not to care. Lenore wore so much lipstick that it rubbed off around the screw top, and every time Sammy took a drink, she tasted that lipstick, and she thought, the woman wearing it, this woman she didn't know who kept leaning in to whisper loudly about all the other moms. There was something nice about it, something unusual, an extra moment that was hers alone. It all felt strangely important somehow, and she wished the moment could have lasted. "Finish your cheese," Sammy said now, watching her son methodically chew every bite. That's how he ate. Though her son's brain was still a mystery, there were things about him that she did know. He was whip-smart and a fast learner. He was graceful, with cat-like reflexes. She and Monica both felt he could have been a dancer, could have done gymnastics. He could catch a ball, skip rope for hours, clap on beat. He walked with confidence, more so than most children his age, regardless of gender. He was neat and tidy, for the most part. More than most boys that age, she knew, or at least she thought she knew. Okay, so he wasn't always neat, and he wasn't always graceful or well-behaved. He shouted sometimes, threw fits, shut down altogether. He was normal until he wasn't. Maybe that's how it was with every child. Often there were days Sammy had to remind herself that just because her son acted a certain way, withdrawn or sullen or hostile, didn't mean he'd act that way forever. It was hard to raise a kid, different from what she'd expected when she was pregnant. "Could I have a bite?" Sammy asked. Samson passed a sweaty square of cheese up to her from the front seat. She nibbled at it until it resembled a misshapen heart, then wiggled it at him. "Check it out. That's nacho cheese, Samson. That's mine." He didn't smile back at her, but his face softened, and that was something. And that's where I'll stop. Thank you so much.
Great. So we'll talk for a little while, and then at a certain point, I'll ask if there's anyone who has questions in the audience. And if you do, please raise your hand, and they'll come over with a mic. Yeah, and then we can move into that. But a question I wanted to start with, something I'm thinking about in both of your pieces, and I think in mine as well, is almost the idea of like the story one learns to tell about oneself, right? And since this is family as a theme, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about like the idea of the stories families teach us to tell us about ourselves, and if or how that or the stories people tell in families, right? And how that maybe influenced what you read and the work and your work in general.
I think family stories are always what I'm most drawn to because they feel like shared and past information, and they also change and evolve.
Yeah.
Kind of bringing it back to like talking earlier about like everybody in a family being like an unreliable narrator. Everybody brings their own like version of events to a story that's held inside of a household, but how they get shared and passed down becomes like the tone can shift of those things, like, right? It's like kind of taking the wheel of a car and turning it, like just like maybe a few degrees, and something that was hard in the moment it occurred becomes something that you still want to share at like a holiday with each other. That's wild. And we all have them. I think that we all have them. It all feels like a touchstone. And so thinking about like, I mean, because they're sitting and writing fiction, we're writing these stories we're creating, but all stories are created. All stories are from a perspective that is so intensely tied to, you know, through the lens of what they saw. But I don't know, Brando, what do you think?
Yeah, family is complicated for me. Just to briefly summarize, I'm Mexican-American, but I was raised to believe that I was an American Indian. And that's his whole story in and of itself. I wrote a book about it. You could also buy that book at the gift shop if you want. But I often think about the sort of the idea of family for me as this dividing line between this identity that I was raised to believe I was, which was American Indian, and then the identity I actually was, which was Mexican American. And there's like a line in my work which is like, oh, this is what I was raised to believe by my mother and my grandmother, because they were kind of in on it, versus the life that I have now. I discovered my biological father in 2010, and he started his whole life over. He has like 3 daughters, so I have like 3 sisters, just like that. And to me, the new book, My Name is Iris, is very much a representation of what my life would have been like being raised as a certain kind of Mexican American, a certain kind of personality, living in a certain kind of like specific existence. But yeah, for me, it's there hasn't been a single thing that I've written where family isn't all over it. It's just it permeates everything.
As you're talking, something that occurs to me is, so I know I'm not alone in this, but I grew up in a family that was fervent about not telling stories to the outside world, right? It was like a very shame-filled family. And with time, I realized like the idea we had from my grandmother, my mother, my uncle, was like, if we don't tell people these things, no one will know. And it wasn't until I got to be much, much older, like in my late 20s, and I was talking to kids I grew up with, and they were like, we all knew this or that or that. And you people were weird because you wouldn't admit that this thing was happening, but we saw this, we saw that, we saw, whatever. And I wonder, as writers, how do you navigate the line between like, there's the stories that are within the family that are perhaps some of your fuel for your writing, but what do you give to people? And what do you keep for yourself?
My mom said I told people too much. She said that we needed to be more like the mafia and just not tell anybody anything.
Yeah.
I didn't realize how problematic it was to tell that to a 9-year-old until many, many years later. But yeah, I think my mom was operating under this grand fantasy that she needed to be a more fantastical person than she was. She had borderline personality disorder. She was taking speed and fen-phen to lose weight. So there was a lot of sort of crazy stuff happening. And, she passed away years ago. And the thing that I wish that if I had like 1 hour to come back and talk to her, it would be like, you never needed that. You just could have told people straight, like who you are, what your background was, and what our backgrounds were. And those stories would have been interesting to people and fascinating and fun and delightful. So I feel like I have like this obligation now to talk to people about my background, my story. Yeah. And whenever I forget that obligation, people will remind me, oh, Brando Skyhorse, what's up with that? Yeah, I've never heard that question before ever. So, but that's the thing, right? Yeah. I feel like there is as a writer, especially if I'm drawing on autobiographical work, I want to share it with other people.
I'm estranged from my biological family. We all still live in Florida. It's hard to be, my family is a deeply evangelical Southern Baptist. I grew up in that, we're at church 5 days a week, doing a lot of different stuff. It's hard to be a gay daughter in the middle of that. So I do think quite often when I'm thinking about writing about families inside of fiction, so much of how I was raised was told that what I was perceiving as actually happening inside of the household was not what was happening. And so I get really stuck on the unreliability of things because it felt like I was always being told one thing but then living something else. So I was I feel like this is what's happening, but I'm being told instead that my observations and my lived experience are not accurate or they're not what's going on. So this particular book, In With Teeth, I wanted to write about a family where you got a really close perspective from somebody, but then I was I want there to be an acknowledgement that other people exist outside of this, right? Other people that you were around know what's going on inside of your family. They don't know everything, but you don't live in a bubble. You live in a community, you live in places. So I started with almost a writing prompt for myself where I'm what if I insert these little interstitials inside of the narrative where I have these people who aren't necessarily strangers, or sometimes they're strangers, pop up and have a couple paragraphs, and that's kind of what they're witnessing about the family. And you can see whether it touches the same kind of way. And to me, that felt a really helpful thing to think about family narrative, because growing up and feeling the things that I actually was experiencing were not true. I was actually everyone's truth is kind of their own truth. Yeah. And so thinking about that and bringing it into fiction feels really important.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah, I remember, this is kind of a tangent, but in my early 40s or something like that, finding this real good therapist and working through so my dad and I had no relationship. He started another family, and the narrative I had was well, he abandoned me to start this other family, whatever. And there was one of the times so she was the kind of therapist where she would respond to you or poke or whatever. And I remember I was going through one of those times, talking it through, and she said, that's not his story of what happened. And it was such a weird moment because I was the earth agrees that he abandoned me because he's terrible, and that's the end of it. And she said, the same result may have happened, but he's got an entire narrative. And when I thought about it, I knew that narrative, and it was about he and my mom it was difficult, and my mom went back to Uganda and told him we're not coming back, and then he went back up to Syracuse, and then she just came back to New York, and I was it was such a powerful moment of being forced to think about this person who I had villainized or hated my entire life. And her point was you could still hate him, but you have to know that you're not the main character in his story, right? So he's not spending all his time thinking about your pain. And she gave me that revelation before he died, and I really feel like it saved me from spending another 40 years being like, you know, if we had just talked once, he would have said, I'm so sorry, you're the greatest son who ever lived. And I'm, you know, all these kinds of things that, but I was so fascinated by this idea, like what you're saying, the unreliability, but also even that someone else in the story I'm painting, if it was them telling it, there would be such a different path. And everyone who I think of as the virtuous people would be, at the very least, much more flawed. And it can be sometimes, at least for me, sometimes hard then to think about, like, well, then who do you decide to tell the story about? And how does that change what you're doing? You know?
That's a damn good therapist, by the way.
Great.
Because my therapist just makes me watch a ball on a screen for 40 minutes and calls that therapy. But yeah, like that's, yeah. Sorry, again, revealing too much. But yeah, like whose story is it, right? Who is the first person, who is, and how are you, what's the best way to tell that story? What's the best way to put that?
I mean, I just wonder how, as writers, you choose almost, you know, because like when she said that, it really threw me off, because then I could think about like, oh, even like a story or a book that I was so sure like this is the way it had to be told. And then with some space and time, I go like, oh, what if it had been that person telling it? All these things would be different. And how fascinating that was just to think about.
Yeah.
You know.
I mean, I think it's too, like sometimes I feel like I naturally gravitate towards the messiest person. I mean, as writers, isn't that fun?
That's the most fun.
Right?
Yeah.
So much fun for somebody to be messy. Like, thank you for giving me so much material to work with in your messy life. But I also think too, like, and maybe I just feel like this as a person, failures teach us so much more about life and ourselves and the world than successes do. Sure. I feel like successes train us not to see anything or to like stop learning sometimes. And so it is exciting to like look at like a character who has flaws and has continued to be flaws, and then see the people around them who also, I also think people who don't get the joke are always the most fun to write about. I love being the one that's like, haha, like I get the joke and you don't.
Yeah.
And that's like always, right? Like there's always somebody inside a family that's like, oh, you just don't get the joke, maybe.
The humorless one. Yeah. Or the clueless one, maybe.
Yeah.
Well, I want to take a turn because so beforehand, as we were like thinking through like how to make the panel work, I had asked if they could share some questions they would love to be asked, and I feel like after what we've been talking about so far, a sweet question that was among those questions was, what's the nicest thing that a family member or maybe somebody close to you has said about your work or has in some way shared about your work? Just as a little palate cleanser. You know,
somebody said, I don't hate this. So, and that's kind of a win, isn't it? Like, yeah, I mean, like, you know, I think everyone, I don't, do we have writers in here who are not writers who were invited, but like writers who like, you know, yeah, I hear yes, all right? So, you ever done that thing where you shared like your work with somebody and they're like, yes, great, yeah, thanks a lot. Like, you know, if you were looking for something specific. I think there's that sense that you're looking for that approbation. You're looking for that sense of approval, especially from people who perhaps aren't writers or aren't practitioners. And it's almost an impossible task. And to have somebody come in and say, like, look, I don't really get what you do. I don't understand why it took you 7 years to write a 300-page book. I don't understand how you monetize, you know, like all these sorts of things. Like, why aren't you on YouTube? Why aren't you on this or that, right? But to have somebody kind of come to it and say, I don't hate this. I get it.
Yeah.
That's a really nice thing.
Oh, yeah, I think it's, I did have, my grandmother read something that I had written. I was very stressed about it. As you might imagine, a gay kid would be imagined, like evangelical grandmother reading something. And after she was done reading it, she goes, "Oh, but this is nice, though." And I was like, "What in her?" I was like, "Oh, I was like, that's very lovely, and thank you." But I was like, was she imagining some kind of like really rip them apart thing? But then she was like, "I think you should write about this cat that keeps like living on the roof." And I was like, "Sure, okay." So is that followed up by quickly like some like, here's what you could be writing.
Yeah.
You could write a 300-page of that, like
Cat
that.
books sell, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, cat books sell.
Yeah, so on my, my family doesn't really, they don't read my stuff, which is in many ways like their greatest gift to give. So I can just do mostly whatever I want, But my mom does keep the books. She has a little shelf near the TV, and she has all the books there, And she always says, "I like these covers." That's always. And I take that as I pass it on to the designers. I let them know they have really made my mother happy. So that's something. But looking at the time, I think just as a heads up, if people do have questions, this would be the time, I think, because we're only here till 4:10, if I understand it. So if people do have questions, you can raise your hands, and they will come over to you with a mic. The lights come up and everything. Nice.
Oh, there's one over there.
Yes, yeah.
I have a friend who says that sibling is the great unexplored relationship. So could you talk a little bit about how you incorporate the perspective of siblings in your work?
Do we all? That's a question.
I do.
I do.
Yeah. Do you too?
So I just recently acquired siblings.
Oh, yeah.
So like as of like 14 years ago, and the sibling who I think thinks this main character is modeled after, she's the one that said, "I don't hate this."
Oh, okay. So it's the
I
right
think that's
one.
as clear an answer as I can give you, if that makes sense. I did also write a memoir, and I have 3 sisters. One was like, "Yeah, I'll get around to reading it." The other was like, "I just skimmed it looking for my name. I'm sorry." And then the third was like, "Oh, I thought this was really, I thought a lot about this after reading it. We should talk about it sometime." And then we still haven't had that talk, and that was about 11 years ago. So, my siblings in a nutshell. So.
Yeah, I wrote in for my first novel, Mostly Dead Things. It's a book about a lesbian taxidermist who takes over her family's taxidermy business after her father commits suicide. I made this joke yesterday. That classic story. The one we all know. But in it, I really wanted there to be this, my protagonist, Jessalyn, is very close with her father, and she's like the protege for this shop. And her brother is very close in age to her, like a year younger. And in this kind of like world of taxidermy, it's also like a lot of hunting culture and a lot of very specific kind of like traditional masculinity in this kind of way. And so I wanted to write in like this relationship between these 2 siblings. Like they're very, very close. They share a love interest. They grew up together and they still both work in the shop. But like what it means like for her to be like the son in the family that's taking over a business, and like what that would mean for her, but then what it would mean for him. Yeah. So I did write in. It was important to me to see that because I was like, this is like a brother-sister relationship that like has its moments of like grief and loss and like anger, because I think you can be so mad at a sibling in a way that you've never felt in your body for another human being. I do also have a brother, and I was like, oh my God. I remember like there was such a time when my dad brought home boxing gloves, and he put boxing gloves on the 2 of us, and he said we could just knock around until we got it out of our system, and I took that seriously. And he was a year and a half younger than me, and we just went at it with each other, and after it was over, I was sobbing, and he was like, that didn't even hurt. I was like, you're lying, so then we fought again.
Yeah.
But I just think there's it's such a rich terrain to like write about like siblings. That's like, it's such an intense, like close, or can be.
Yeah.
But it can also be this thing where it's like, yeah, these are siblings I had that I didn't even know. Those are like just so broad. A million things to write about. A good thing to know that there's books we can write forever.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, and also, I mean, sometimes I do feel, thinking about siblings, maybe in particular, but like, sometimes the unfairness of also like what we expect of family in a way, like all the things that a sibling should be to me. I have 2 younger siblings, a brother and a sister, or parents or grandparents, whatever it is, like things that we would never demand of other human beings, even though other human beings might actually better serve those needs, right? At least for me, I'm the oldest sibling, and the other 2 siblings, one has died, and the other one is needs care and will need care probably her whole life of a certain kind. So for me, the big thing was working through, like when I look back on my stuff, the early stuff, there's a good deal of resentment about being, for lack of better terms, the responsible one, right? And then as I've gotten older, in the books, trying to wrestle with like, well, you did get a lot out of that too, right? There's a lot of power that I had in that, and still have in that relationship, and trying to think about it from her point of view, where it's sort of like, why do we always have to check with you? You know, I'm in my 40s now, and Mom still says, well, what does Victor suggest about this? Or why don't we talk with him? Why don't we talk as a family about this? But she never says, I never have to consult with my sister about whether my wife and I should buy a house, right? We just bought a house.
Yeah.
And then we invited them over sometimes, you know? And so, yeah, so it's interesting, even that, like birth order and all that stuff, like how does that play into how one depicts siblings and what one thinks is their right to do, right, as well. Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, I don't know if we even answered that question, but we certainly spoke. Yeah. Are there any other questions? I have a question, actually. It occurred to me as we were each reading. I wondered, and this may be very broad and maybe you've heard it too many times, but I wonder, how did the state you grew up, since we're from 3 distinct states, how did the state you grew up in, you feel like, shape who you were, or states, if it's more than one? I don't think, no, anyway.
Yeah.
Like that idea of like landscape creating you.
You're from Florida. I feel you should answer that
I will.
first.
Yes,
I will.
hometown.
I will. Happily. I consider myself to be a place writer. Florida is very much in my work and all of my work that I do. I like how Florida functions, right? Like crawls inside of everything all the time. You can't keep it out. Like living things, plants, 1,000 lizards. Like even like people, like I had a friend come down from New York and she's like, what's that shit on all the trees? I'm like, Spanish moss? She's like, what is that shit? I'm like, oh. There's just like things that like creep their way into my work. So I feel like my books don't exist without Florida. It feels like it's very like so present in like how I see myself. And also, I love that like, Florida's a lot of things. It is never boring, right? Isn't that wonderful? Sometimes the thing that's the most horrible thing in the world for me, especially as a writer, is to be bored. I hate being bored of my own work. I can say with 100% certainty, I've never once been bored writing about this place. It doesn't let you. There's like my wife, my beautiful wife, who's sitting over here. I got her to like move down here to live with me, and the first day she was here, I was like, oh, look outside. She's like, oh, what is it? It's a squirrel. I'm like, no, it's snakes, see? And she was like, oh, and I was like, welcome. It is, so it's something too where it's like, I think it shapes like so much of, it also allows me to re-examine like myths and tropes that people have about this place where I live. I grew up in Orlando. I'm 3rd generation Orlando. And people have a lot to say about that place. I know they have a lot to say about the Keys too. People have a lot to say about Florida. But it's been a privilege, I feel like, to live inside of Central Florida and get to be an ambassador for writing about a place that I feel like people treat as a tourist joke. Or people treat as though they have all the information about that. Because I feel like people can feel like they have all the information about you as a person. And the reality is there's so much more, there's so much else going on. And so inside my work, I get the privilege of writing about what this place can look like from a specific perspective. And so I feel like that's in everything I write.
Are we good on time, or
I think I think we'll give the. Yeah,
okay. I just wanted to make sure. So I was born and raised in California, but I've lived around a lot, moved around a lot. I live in Indiana now. Is that my wife cheering? Okay. Oh, sorry. That's Meg cheering. Okay, right. So, Indiana's been an adjustment, to be sure. Choosing my words carefully here. I feel like California, again, it's a word that like conjures up like a lot of ideas about like place because it's so massive, and the mountains and the beaches and the fires and the horrible devastation we're seeing coming out of it. So it's a weird thing in that like I've been publishing now for about 15 years. Working on book number 5 now, which is set in California. Every single thing I've published, every single thing that I've written is about California, but I haven't lived there in over 25 years. So there is that sense of feeling in a way almost like an exile, that like for some strange reason, I'm trying to get back to that California of my youth, which was so formative and so gigantic in so many ways. So again, it's interesting to live in an environment right now in Indiana when I tell people I'm from LA, and almost invariably, like people kind of like, it's like they just had like a slice of lemon. Ooh, LA, really? You know what I mean? Because there's so many like stereotypes. There's so much kind of baggage to it, and I feel like the one thing that I still try to do as a writer is to try to like reclaim that part of California, even though again, like I have family there, relatives there, I haven't lived there in many years, but I'm still trying to kind of reclaim the essence of what I feel like the actual California experience is. Not Hollywood, not the sort of like, all the tropes you see on TV, but something that feels like genuine and real to, my experience. Yeah.
Yeah, wow. It's interesting. Like I feel like so I'm from New York, and in a similar way to what both of you are saying, it is another place that is eye-rollingly ubiquitous. Yes, but to your point, like only the parts of it that I also feel sick of, right? Like and that if anything, for me, the idea of the outer boroughs of New York, particularly the especially unattractive ones, Queens, Staten Island, maybe the Bronx, are still ripe for this idea of like they're not only like as stories of cities, but as ecosystems. The biggest park in all of New York is in the Bronx, not Central Park, and that kind of thing. And loving the chance to sort of dive into those stories and tell those stories and feel like as the cliche goes, like that the map of literature is constantly being expanded because either people are from a place and they write about it, or just as powerfully, people come to that place and they see it in a way that natives can't see it. And just so just feeling like that, and then also maybe I feel deeply invested in, because of my own bias, I personally think the only nice people in the United States are from New York City, right? But by that, what I mean is the only genuinely nice, not sweet, right? Absolutely, I feel like, because for me, like a thing that happened not that long ago, so we're in the Bronx now, and there was this guy who had clearly rented a Jeep with like extra large tires, and he was driving through this little part of Kingsbridge where we are, and he just basically slammed the car into like a crack big enough that his wheel got like kind of jammed in there real bad, and then all these dudes who I'm absolutely sure, when I was looking at the guy, I was absolutely sure he thought they were going to come cannibalize him. But they came up to the Jeep and they began working to jimmy it out of the hole and then start helping him change the tire and even like repair the rim. And the entire time they were like, "What the fuck is wrong with you, you fucking moron? Why would you do?" And he had to put up with that in order to get saved. And to me, that is true sweetness, if I may say. And on that note, we say, thank you very much, everybody.